everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose. My name is Morgan Harding, and I'm an event staffer here at the store, where we host a range of in store events like this one, along with classes and trips. Before we get started today, I'd like to ask you all to please silence your cell phones as to not disrupt the event. And when we get to the Q&A portion of the event, we have a standing microphone over here next to this pillar. We would love for you all to speak into so everyone in the store can hear you. So, we are here tonight to celebrate the new book by David J. Lynch, The World's Worst Bet: How the Globalization Gamble Went Wrong and What Would Make It Right, with David Ignatius. David J. Lynch is the global economics correspondent of The Washington Post, the recipient of the National Press Foundation's Henrich Award for Distinguished Reporting on Trade in 2021. Lynch has reported for more than 60 countries for the Post and earlier in his career with the Financial Times of London, Bloomberg News, and USA Today. Currently lives in Vienna, Virginia. Lynch will be in conversation with David Ignatius. Ignatius is a prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and has been covering the Middle East and the CIA for 4 decades. He has written several New York Times bestsellers. He's also been to the store for all 12 books, if you did not know that, and he lives in Washington, D.C. Let's give our guests a round of applause.
So we authors love politics and prose. I just want to make that clear to make a plug for uh, Washington's best bookstore and the real feature of our cultural life. So I'm so pleased to be here with my colleague David Lynch, one of the many great bylines in the Washington Post. I just want to remind people we're doing great coverage every day, and we're proud to be doing that. So, David, this book is an extraordinary tour of the economic history of the last 30 years. But I want to begin. This book is told through your own personal experience in part, and I want to start with the fact that you grew up in a classic city that was a victim in a sense of globalization and what it did to manufacturing. That city is Holyoke, Massachusetts, Milltown in Western Massachusetts, of special interest to me because my mother was born there, and she lived all of her childhood in that Milltown. My grandfather worked for the National Blank Book Company, one of the paper mills there. So talk a little bit about Holyoke, what it was, what happened to it, and how that illustrates the theme of your book.
Sure. Thanks. Oops. That on? Yeah. First, thanks to Politics and Prose for having me. As David said, this is a Washington institution, and good to see it still up and running and doing land office business here. Holyoke, for those who don't know, it is, as David said, one of the places where the Industrial Revolution really started in the United States in the 19th century, along with Lowell and Lawrence and similar places that were situated along the rivers there in New England. And my Irish ancestors came over in the middle of the 19th century and went to work in the paper mills. And Holyoke was a booming town. It was a really important place in the 19th century and well into the 20th. At one point, it had the second largest St. Patrick's Day parade anywhere in the country, second only to New York City. And a guy named John F. Kennedy went there at one point in the 50s to be the guest of honor at the parade. So it was a big deal, and it was a place that employed generations of immigrants in tough, dirty, unforgiving work in the mills there. And then fast forward a few decades, economic circumstances change. There are places that offer cheaper labor in the non-union South. And to make a long story short, the work migrates south, and Holyoke has never really found a second act, I don't think, entirely. Still a nice place in a lot of ways, but the economic heart of that community was pretty much taken out. And it went through cultural changes as well, as different types of immigrants came in, replacing the Irish and the Italians and the Poles. Puerto Ricans came in the 1960s, and that caused some tension with the previous inhabitants. So it is a place that has kind of informed to some degree my understanding of economic change. And I talk about my experiences, not just having been born in a place like Holyoke, but also reporting in Southern California at the end of the Cold War, where I saw the so-called peace dividend play out, 500,000 aerospace jobs disappear in the course of 3 or 4 years. Not nearly the same sort of wreckage left behind as was the case in Holyoke, but certainly a lot of trauma for an industrial workforce there. And also the reporting I did overseas in 1998, being in Indonesia to cover Suharto's fall, which of course was part and parcel of the Asian financial crisis, which we can talk about a little bit more afterwards. But I did try to bring to this account of the last 30 years or so an understanding that was informed by both my personal history and my reporting.
So you speak in your book about the globalization gamble, and your title is pretty descriptive, "The World's Worst Bet." So tell us what the gamble was, and then begin to tell us why that bet didn't turn out the way people expected.
Sure. Well, if the title got your attention, it did what it was supposed to do. Book titles are there to move the merchandise. And the first step in moving the merchandise.
That's what we say when there's a headline on our pieces that we're not sure we like. I don't write the headline.
That's exactly right. I'm guilty as charged with the title, though. To me, the globalization gamble, and I should stipulate at the outset, globalization as a phenomenon has been enormously beneficial, both globally and here in the United States. Around the world, it's lifted something like 1.5 billion people out of the worst sort of crushing poverty. But even here in a so-called advanced economy like the United States, it spread benefits across the whole economy like frosting on a cake. And it meant a better mix of jobs. It meant better availability of products. It meant lower costs, almost non-existent inflation for many years until the pandemic. And so those are all good things. But to me, the globalization gamble that I describe and critique was the implicit bet that I think our leaders made, which was that we could enjoy all of these great things and not really worry about the costs, not worry about the price tag, not worry about the people who weren't able to fully participate. And so to me, the bet was that we could effectively ignore the distributional costs, what Bill Clinton referred to as the winners and losers. That yes, the economy as a whole would grow and prosper, but there would be winners and losers. And in Clinton's formulation, that was okay because the gains that the winners would realize would be so great that they could devote some of it to providing for the quote-unquote losers, the folks in the economy with the least amount of education and the fewest skills, basic manufacturing workers. They'd be provided for. They'd get relocation assistance. They'd get help to make ends meet. They'd get whatever was really needed to position them so that no one was left behind. That was the mantra of the time. Likewise, corporations made their own bet on global supply chains that were optimized for low cost above everything else, and left us vulnerable in ways we didn't fully recognize, although there were warnings, multiple warnings along the way that we can discuss, but we didn't fully recognize the costs and the vulnerabilities we had taken on until the pandemic exposed them. Unfettered global capital flows that contributed to and caused the Asian financial crisis that I saw firsthand in Indonesia, and that later made our own housing bubble and subsequent crash worse than it otherwise would have been. And finally, our failure to fully anticipate or understand how China was going to respond to its increased prosperity. There was an assumption early on, a sort of slightly naive assumption that greater trade would promote greater peace and harmony around the world, that our former communist adversaries in the Soviet Union and in China would happily join a US-led international order, and that expanded trade would encourage political liberalization in these authoritarian regimes in a way that, of course, has not turned out to be the case.
Let's talk a little bit more about China, which is in some ways the most dramatic example of the success of a globalized economy, and also has become the kind of benchmark for the difficulties that it's produced. I first went to China in 1984, and I remember traveling to Sichuan province, and that was where there were economic reforms that led to this startling Chinese economic explosion began. And in Chengdu, the capital of Sichuan, the first signs were people setting up stalls on the streets to, cut your toenails, to fix, your boils, to sell you. I mean, there's odd little things. I decided I was going to have my feet worked on, and my colleague said, "Are you out of your mind?" But China, in an astonishing speed, went from that sort of primitive place to this, incredibly dynamic economy. I can remember thinking when I first went there that free markets will make free Chinese men and women. That bet, which is part of the globalization bet, was one worth taking. So I want you to unpack that and how many people made a similar bet about China and why it's gone so wrong.
Yeah, it's a fascinating part of the story because, if you the arc of the story that I tell starts about 30 years ago in the immediate post-Cold War years. And the optimism of that time, looked at from today, seems to some degree foolish or naive, but I don't view it that way. We all lived through that. And if you put the China piece in the context of what policymakers of the day had already lived through by the time China became a trade issue, you've seen the Berlin Wall crumble. You've seen the Soviet Union vanish, disappear on Christmas Day, gone. The Warsaw Pact, gone. All of these countries in Eastern Europe become effectively overnight democracies trying to set up markets. It was phenomenal. India, separate and apart from this, turning its back to some degree on a state-run economy. So the amount and pace of the change was really unbelievable. And so it did not seem incredible at that time to imagine that China would inevitably be the next piece of the puzzle to slot into place, particularly in the wake of Tiananmen Square, where you could see literally a statue of the goddess of democracy, I think it was called, basically emulating the Statue of Liberty. It seemed like, this is just moments away from a democratic China. Of course, that didn't happen, but there were reasons to think, and this was a bipartisan thing. Bill Clinton, in 1998, at the end of a trip he made to China, was asked, Mr. President, do you think you'll ever see a democratic China? Do you think that's going to come about? He said, absolutely, I do. And he went on to suggest that the then current rulers, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, would be the guys to bring it about. George Bush, then a candidate for president, talked about the opening to China on trade and said something along the lines of economic freedom creates habits of liberty, and habits of liberty will lead to democracy. So there was an explicit view that expanded trade would create a property-owning middle class. That middle class would, over time, demand a greater say in how they were governed, and one happy day in the future, if not a true democracy, perhaps China would follow the lead of the other East Asian economies and become a multi-party state or a less authoritarian system. And of course, that didn't happen, and it became apparent even before the Beijing Olympics in 2008. People now tend to ascribe China's turn away from some of the promised reforms and the hopes of liberalization, the hopes in the West of liberalization, ascribe that to Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012, 2013. But in fact, the turn had started before that. It had started before the Beijing Olympics under Xi's colorless predecessor, Hu Jintao. And I should say, I think somewhere in the journalist dictionary of required terms, the word colorless must appear before Hu Jintao. I'm guilty of it all the time. I don't know who made that decision, but I'm helpless.
Mercurial is another one of those.
Yes. So who earned that term? But the system there had the reform momentum that was quite real in the 1990s and the early 2000s. The Chinese did an enormous amount to remake their system to comply with the requirements of the WTO, to comply with what they had agreed to do in the terms of accession to join that organization. Thousands of regulations rewritten, educating officials down to the provincial and lower levels, a real national effort that had sort of a genuine enthusiasm behind it. Joining, we think of the WTO as this sort of faceless, dull bureaucracy. But in those years in China, this was a real national reckoning and a national excitement that China was joining the world economy in a very visible, real way. And the reforms worked. The Chinese economy in the years, we moved there about 6 months after WTO entry. And boy, the vibrancy in the society, you could just feel it. To my way of imagining it, I think probably post World War II America had that same sort of feeling. The country was visibly changing every day, right before your eyes. You could see it happening. New buildings would be knocked, or old buildings would be knocked down, and the new ones would go up in a matter of months. The pace of change was just extraordinary. It was a country where you could see, particularly the young people, starting to live a life that their parents could not have even imagined a couple of decades earlier. So it was exciting and gratifying to witness. But the reform momentum petered out. There were interests, of course, in any bureaucracy, in any government. It's not a monolith, even in an authoritarian system. And there were interests that pushed back from the state-owned industries, and they're supporting politicians. And so the reforms increasingly petered out. By the time she came to power, the road was leading back towards a state-dominated system, and that's part of the story of how we've ended up where we've ended up.
So before we get to the political train wreck in America that globalization arguably has produced, I want to ask you about steps along the way that might have made a difference. One powerful theme of your book is that people kept talking about making adjustments to protect those who would be hurt, but they never really did it. And just walk us through that continuing, decades-long process of inattention and non-performance by politicians.
Yeah, this was something, you always have to be careful. As I guess I'm an amateur historian. I'm a professional journalist, amateur historian. It's easy to look back and say, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. Hindsight is 2020. And I try not to do that. I try as much as possible to consider the question from the perspective of what people knew at the time and how the world looked to policymakers at the time. Because I think that's, it's easy after, if the commanders go for it on 3rd and 3 and they run into the line and get stuffed, it's easy to say, oh, well, they should have passed. But I try not to do too much of that. So consider that Bill Clinton back in the 90s said repeatedly that if we don't address this winners and losers issue, if we don't provide for the people who would otherwise be left behind, that should be a moral imperative. But put aside the moral question, if we don't do that, we're going to lose the political support for further trade liberalization, which is what we want to do, because that's going to make us all richer. So we've got to take care of people, or they're not going to put up with this. They're not going to participate. They're not going to give us their votes. And he said it repeatedly. And as a matter of fact, one of his last appearance at Davos at the beginning of 2000 as president, he pointed out, the economy was going gangbusters. The budget had been balanced for a couple of years. He said, if we don't address this now, if we can't take care of our people now, we're never going to get to it. And he was right. We never got to it. Now, in the Bush administration, to President George W. Bush, I think from an ideological point of view, just did not see this as a concern. I interviewed Bush, I think it was back in 2006 or thereabouts. And by then, Hank Paulson, who was his then Treasury Secretary, had begun talking about trying to do more about this concern. And I put it to Bush whether that was needed, and he said no. The programs of the time, the chief one is something called trade adjustment assistance. He thought those were perfectly adequate. To him, job retraining was kind of a waste of time. He often told an anecdote about these job training programs that would produce 3,000 hairdressers, and the community only needed 3. So what good does that do? It always got a laugh. Didn't do anybody any good who needed help, but it did get a laugh. But even one of the people I interviewed for the book, Glenn Hubbard, who was one of Bush's top economic advisors, has come around to the position now that more should have been done. The list of policymakers who now acknowledge that mistakes were made is long and bipartisan. Mike Froman, who is President Obama's chief trade negotiator, Bob Rubin, who's Secretary of Treasury under Clinton. Many of them now look back and say, yeah, we should have done more. So why didn't they? Well, there was always something else that seemed to take priority over the needs of the disadvantaged workers. Once the Republicans took control of Congress in '94, it became balancing the budget. And that became a political fetish in Washington in the late 90s. And remember, there's no real magic about a balanced budget. There's no reason why, so long as your economy is growing, you can't tolerate a 1%, 2% of GDP as a budget deficit. There's no magic about actually balancing the national budget. And after a couple of years of being in balance, Alan Greenspan, the then chairman of the Federal Reserve, was publicly worrying that if that continued, we'd have no more Treasury securities to sell in the market, and so that would be a problem. We cured that problem pretty quickly. So it was always, it was always something. It was the balanced budget. Then, of course, we get into the early 2000s. We got the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, a desire to keep China on side in the war on terror, or have their support in negotiations with North Korea. So there was always some other priority that took precedence over addressing these concerns.
So let's talk about the train wreck. Both parties ended up deciding that globalization manifested in the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and that idea of free trade was politically dangerous and abandoned it. Hillary Clinton did that in 2016. I can remember getting into a ferocious argument at a conference with Jake Sullivan, who was her principal advisor that year about the TPP. And obviously Donald Trump played this issue as hard as he could in getting elected for the first time, and then really even more on his way to the White House this year. Trump has made trade really the centerpiece of his economic policy. And I want to ask you first to think through the arguments that Trump and Scott Bessent and others in the administration make on behalf of their tariff policies, and then offer your own critique of whether that's right, their arguments are right, and what the consequences of these policies may be.
Let's see. So I think the way I think about how we got to President Trump getting into the White House to begin with is, to use sort of a metaphor from the pandemic, the China shock, what economists call the China shock, which was the effect of the flood of Chinese goods coming into the country after China joined the WTO, was sort of the pre-existing condition for a lot of these working class communities, because it decimated specific cohorts of people in specific communities. Remember, as I said earlier, the benefits from globalization and from trade with China were spread across the entire economy. We all benefited. But the costs were felt in concentrated places and among concentrated groups of people. They bore all the cost of the party that the rest of us were enjoying. And that was bad enough, but then we have the global financial crisis, which is exacerbated by some of these global capital flows. That hits many of these same people again. And so by the time you get to 2015, 2016, they've also felt like they've had no response from the political system. The choices that the system is giving them in 2008, you've got Barack Obama and John McCain. Obviously, big differences on many issues between those two, but McCain was not someone who was mounting a real economic focused challenge, and certainly in the shadow of the financial crisis, there wasn't room for that. 2012, it's Obama and Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney's certainly not somebody who's going to challenge the existing order. So it's only by 2016, with this completely disruptive outsider who is not bound by any norms and completely willing to challenge any sort of received wisdom, who, for many of these working class communities, is saying things they believe and that no one else has said. And so trade and immigration together become the solvent that glues these people to Trump. Now, as to the policies that they're focusing in this second term, this is a couple of observations, because I covered the first Trump trade wars and the second. And the second is, a trade offensive on steroids, because there's nobody, the sort of team he had around him in the first term, who in many cases, or in a few key cases, people like Gary Cohn, Steve Mnuchin, acted to sort of channel his impulses into a less threatening or less disruptive channel. Now the team is there to do what the president's instincts tell him to do. They're there to make sure he gets what he wants. And that's how, in the space of 6 months, we've gotten ourselves to the highest tariffs since the 1930s. Now, we've had between the president and his advisors, we've heard multiple explanations of what the objectives will be, from reshoring manufacturing and encouraging greater domestic production, to just a simple revenue grab. We're going to use tariffs as tax revenue to pay for the tax legislation, the fiscal legislation, the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill that Congress recently passed. There's little evidence to support the idea that you can reverse the decline in manufacturing employment that every advanced economy has gone through, and that even China is now experiencing. Just as we, once had most of the people in the country working on farms, and then they left the farms. Why? Because automation allowed us to produce all the food we needed with fewer people actually doing that kind of backbreaking work. Similar process has taken us from the 1950s, where 1 out of every 3 workers worked in a factory, to today, where it's less than 1 out of 12. To turn that around, now if you made that your objective and you were happy to spend any amount of money and accept any amount of economic inefficiency, you could do it. But maybe you could bump it up to 9% from, it's about 8.3 today. Maybe get it up to 9, but at enormous cost. What's more likely to happen, as most economists will say, is that you can certainly encourage, if you leave the tariffs in place, you'll encourage some manufacturing work to come back, but most of it will be done by machines.
I want to ask you about the financial side of globalization. You mentioned the process of the unrestricted capital flows that led to the Asian financial crisis and then contributed to 2008. But you could make a pretty strong argument that the resilience of this global financial system, the American dominance of it, I mean, we are the kind of central nervous system of the world's financial system, has generally been benign. That the system is quick, transparent. There are deeper capital markets for the whole world. What about that counter argument?
Yeah, there's no question that we have the deepest, most liquid capital markets in the world, and that's been a source of great prosperity for us. But I think we've learned some lessons over the past few decades, and I think the sort of so-called light touch, one thing that has now fallen deservedly out of favor, I think, is what was called the light touch financial regulation model that originated here and that we effectively exported to the UK and to Europe, which basically allowed banks to set their own capital reserve requirements. Now, what does that mean? A bank has a choice. Without any regulation at all, a banker would love to put every dollar he has to work, because that's how you make money. Put that money, loan it out to somebody, invest it. That's how you make money. But if times go bad and your depositors want their money, you need some money to give them. So you have to hold something in reserve. And under the light touch regulatory scheme in the UK, in Europe, banks were basically allowed to determine their own capital reserve ratios, in part because there was competition to become sort of the European leader. The regulators operated on a state-by-state basis. There was no real Europe-wide regulator. And so the competitive instincts and the national instincts to become the European champion led to lower regulation than would have been safe. And that was modeled on things that Alan Greenspan said. He saw at the time the securitization of the mortgage-backed securities that played a critical role in the 2008 crisis. He saw that process as dispersing risk around the world, which could be a good thing. In fact, we later learned it was concentrating risk in ways we didn't fully understand that nearly blew up the system. And Greenspan gave a speech in London, I think it was in 2002, in the early part of this chapter, and people raised some of these concerns, and he acknowledged them and said, so far, so good.
So I want to ask you where you think globalization is going, and maybe one way to begin that conversation is for you to share, as you did in the Washington Post a few days ago, your conversation with the king of globalization, if you will, President Bill Clinton, as Clinton looks back on what he wrought and his reflections, and then your own reflections about where this story is heading next.
Yeah, I'll confess, I find Clinton an almost endlessly fascinating political character in every meaning of that word. And he was a fascinating interview. I had the good fortune to spend about 75 minutes with him early last year. And, very thoughtful guy, looks back on this, acknowledged right up front when I suggested that the big failure here was to keep the promise to the so-called losers and make sure that nobody was left behind. He said, I agree with that. And his analysis was that basically, in his words, the private sector had kind of outfoxed the public sector. That as capital became more mobile, it became harder for individual national governments to effectively tax that capital, because if the taxes got too onerous, capital could flee offshore. I was a little disappointed, I think, in his ultimate verdict, though, because it was essentially, and I said this in the piece, he makes the same argument, and I think it's largely true that we're at the level of the species, we're better off if we cooperate and collaborate. None of us have a monopoly. No country's got a monopoly on wisdom or good ideas. And so we'll be better off if we collaborate. And, we have to embrace change and embrace the future. And I think that's true. But it was true 30 years ago. And it's necessary but not sufficient to recognize that. I think, and I said this the other day in my launch speech, for the folks who want to see trade liberalization come back on the agenda, and we've had none of it for the last decade, under 3 presidencies, only 2 of which have been named Trump. So this has been a bipartisan rejection to some degree. So for folks who want to see the engine of trade liberalization get going again, I don't think it's enough to just list the same economic arguments that people have heard for 30 years. There's got to be something added to that message that makes it safe to go into Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Indiana and advance these arguments and promote that case. Because at the end of the day, we're not talking about an economics seminar at Yale. We're talking about winning and holding political power so that you can make these economic changes. Now, as to where it's going, I think it's important to say that globalization is not ending. We're not, to my way of thinking, de-globalizing. Globalizing is changing. It's probably going to be less China-centric, but that doesn't mean we're going to cut off all trade with China. That would probably be impossible. One thing that I don't think is fully understood, including by some of the people who make policy, is that China is marbled throughout products. Chinese components are marbled throughout products that come from Thailand and Vietnam and Mexico and Canada and Europe and everywhere else. So you can think that you're decoupling from China by putting up a wall in the South China Sea, but unless you recognize where all the components are coming from in everything else you buy, that's almost a phony decoupling. So globalization is changing, even to the extent that merchandise or goods trade has sort of plateaued for the last several years as a share of the world economy. Services trade across borders, investment advice, technology advice, anything that can be sent digitally, movies, entertainment, that is growing by leaps and bounds, and that's where the action is going to be with globalization. That's something that the president never talks about. He only talks about sort of the old style economy, the steel and the coal and the shipbuilding, which is all important. People, have jobs there. That's important stuff, but it gives you an incomplete picture of the economy, and I think an incomplete picture of globalization.
So we're going to turn to the audience in another 5 minutes. Just be thinking about the questions that you want to ask David. You just said something that fascinated me, which is,
I hope it was true.
What is it that? Well, it was a question, really. What is it that a Democratic politician would say in Ohio or in Pittsburgh or other Rust Belt cities that got pounded by globalization that speaks to a future that's going to be more positive and dynamic? President Trump has an answer, which is these very high tariffs, and in part cutting us off from traditional trading relationships. The spectacle of those South Korean workers being handcuffed at a plant that they thought they were trying to help create American jobs was pretty amazing. But what is the thing that as you listen to this debate, you think somebody might go to Ohio and say credibly that speaks of a different future than the one we're now embarked on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would start with a couple of things, and one component is sequencing. But I think the first thing I would say if I were out there on the stump, and I can assure you I'm not running, but I think you start by saying we can't make you workers more prosperous by making things cost more. That's not going to do it. We're trying that. It's not working. It doesn't help your business if I make the stuff that you buy to put into your product to sell to somebody else. If I make all those parts cost more, if I make the steel cost more, if I allow all the other guys who compete with that foreign steel maker to raise their prices, we're not going to get there by making things cost more. The second thing is sequencing. I think you have to say to people, you've heard decades of promises from politicians tell you they were going to take care of your interests and your needs and position you for this world that is changing. We're seeing it all the time. You can't stop change. You need education, you need training, you need protection when times get hard, you need help from the government. And we know how to do that. We saw how to do that during the pandemic with extended unemployment that by the Federal Reserve's calculation allowed people to maintain their pre-pandemic rate of consumption 50% longer than would have been the case if we didn't put those programs in. So we know how to do this. We had a much faster recovery from the pandemic. We got employment levels back up to where they were before the crisis in 2 years. It took 6 years after the 2008 crisis because we turned to austerity and balanced budgets prematurely. So we're going to sequence it. We're going to pass programs that will address these issues. Maybe we'll experiment with some first to make sure they work. We'll do wage insurance. We'll do some place-based strategies, although they're notoriously difficult. But that'll be the first agenda. Once those protections are in place, and only after they're in place, we'll move on to more trade liberalization or policies that might carry the risk of disruption. And to anybody who would say, well, geez, we can't afford that kind of social program, we don't want to turn into Europe. Fair enough. We don't want to eliminate the dynamism of the labor market, which is a key strength for the United States. But we can afford some of these programs if we address the glaring failures that multiple administrations have identified in the tax system. And this is another thing that has never, it's been tried. It's never really been tried to the degree that's necessary to address some of the profit shifting that goes on, particularly by the pharmaceutical makers. The economist Brad Setzer, the Council on Foreign Relations, has done a lot of good work on this. By his estimate, we could raise, just by cracking down on that loophole, we could raise around $50 billion a year. Even if it wasn't 50, even if you could only get your hands on 10 or 20, there's a lot you could do to address people's social needs before you move to this. And why should we do this? We can't go back in time and fix the China shock. The people who were hurt by that have been hurt, have gone on to do something else with their lives. The China shock ended maybe 15 years ago by this point. But the China shock is not the last upheaval that we're going to go through economically. Just look at the discussion around artificial intelligence. And I'm not the world's greatest expert on AI, so I'll limit my comments on that. But there are people in the industry who say it's going to have a dramatic effect on the labor market, could put a lot of people out of work. Now, technology is a good thing. None of us want to go back to a pre-computer age or a pre-automobile age. So technology is good. Over time, it allows us to live better lives. But the worry with AI is how quickly is this going to happen? How quickly is it going to disrupt old occupations before new opportunities are created? People may need support. It would help them go into this new era knowing that they had a better government safety net.
So wonderful answer. A good moment to turn to the audience for your questions. There's a microphone here. Please line up. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Paul, I have to say I enjoyed your essay about your editor. That was really quite amusing.
I've never been able to write a lead like ugh, ick, please.
Right. He had a
So,
way
thank
with
you.
words, didn't he? So, do you talk about in your book the 92 election where Ross Perot was the third party candidate and got a fair percentage?
19%, I think, if
Yeah,
memory
something
serves.
like that. But one of his main um, points was that the free trade agreement would create this giant sucking sound, taking
Yep.
jobs away from Americans. Was that dealt at that time? Was that dealt with in any serious way, or was that just considered one of his crank positions?
Yeah, no, it got from my memory, and feel free to correct me, but my memory is it did get a lot of attention at the time, and there were proposals made. There was an economist who's now at Harvard, Larry Katz, who had proposed within the Clinton administration a program of much more aggressive trade adjustment assistance. I mentioned this program earlier. John F. Kennedy introduced it in 1962 as a way to get some trade legislation he was promoting through Congress. And that was an illustration of how that program was always going to work. It was always used as sort of a political chit to get something through Congress, minimally funded. Everybody knew it was inadequate. The labor side of the debate regarded it as burial insurance, quote unquote. The corporate side didn't want to spend the money. And so it was always sort of a stepchild. But Larry Katz had promoted a much broader and more elaborate program that he thought he could get through, but labor turned their back on it because, to some degree, the labor leaders liked having trade as an issue to show that trade was hurting their workers, and that retraining them to get jobs either in non-union facilities or in other industries doesn't do me any good as a labor leader. But the interesting thing about NAFTA, just briefly, is that giant sucking sound. The giant sucking sound was never really heard. Manufacturing employment increased every year after NAFTA was introduced for, I think, something like 5 or 6 years. Now, there were, as was the case with China, there were specific impacts on communities and specific cohorts of people that did bear political consequences. But it wasn't the sort of immediate economic disaster that Perot was talking about.
Yeah, thanks so much for this discussion. I'm wondering if you could bring in the element of immigration and how that, which obviously has played such a huge role in President Trump's current agenda, how that dovetails with the sense that people are being left behind by free trade, and how immigration, documented and undocumented, factors in.
No, they're really closely intertwined, and after and there are a lot of opinions about this, but after Trump's 2016 win, there was a big debate. Was it, so-called economic discontent, which became caricatured as reporters from the Washington Post and the New York Times finding sad men in diners in the Midwest to tell them their tale of woe? Or was it cultural, what was sort of euphemistically described as cultural resentment or cultural concerns, or even racial concerns, which is the immigration side? And to me, I always found that debate a little bit unsatisfying. And I also thought there was a degree to which people who were left of center gravitated towards the immigration and / racial argument as a way of almost getting off the hook. Because if the Trump phenomenon is really just about racism, if that's all it is, then we don't need to do anything differently. We don't need to change our policies. Then those people really are deplorable if they're all just a bunch of racists. And to me, I didn't think that was true. I have next door neighbors who are Trump supporters. I have a very good drinking buddy of mine who's a Trump supporter. I think it's a much more complicated phenomenon to that than that. But I think trade is unquestionably a part of it. And if you don't believe me, both Hillary Clinton and Steve Bannon, who probably don't agree on anything else, think that trade was a key engine in this. But it's marbled in with a lot of other things. The people who feel aggrieved by the way the elite policymakers promulgated trade opening that disadvantaged them, also feel those same elite policymakers failed them on the border by the scenes of chaos that they watch every night on their TV, and also failed them by the way they responded to the global financial crisis, where the bankers, the guys who caused the mess in the popular understanding of it, they get off scot-free. My house is foreclosed, or I lose my job because of a terrible recession. And that kind of cumulative repeat beating, hammering of people, giving them the message that basically we don't care about you, by the time 2016 rolls around, left them receptive to a guy who came in with a very disruptive, unorthodox, blunt message on trade and immigration, even if occasionally, or more than occasionally, it was untethered from the facts.
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I'd like to compliment you. I've followed this subject for 40 years, 30 of which at the World Bank, then Europe and in India. And you've actually, in a very accessible way, been very true to actually what was existing in the economics and sort of political economy literature without dumbing things down. So I'd like to delve back into why do you think this neglect of, let's say, or the wrong bet was placed. It wasn't that people didn't know, because it was very much active here in Washington and over. People like Stiglitz wrote Globalization and Discontents. Other people wrote other stuff, Danny Roderick, and on globalization, and saying that some things are inevitable, but things. It was also in the realm. Remember Seattle,
It's chapter 2.
Yeah, so I haven't read. I'm looking forward to reading your book, but all of these things were very much there. But it was within that, and Stiglitz was Clinton's chairman of economic advisors. But these people were. Was it inattention? Was it willful neglect? Was it triumphalism post-Cold War? Was it, let me call it, politics of the elite within? Specifically, one big one at that time, and I think it rings true, was Main Street versus Wall Street. And lastly, was it a fact that globalization, the way has actually at least 4 strings? One is trade, one is immigration that we have talked about, or migration, one is finance, and one is ideas. And I think the fight that occurred, and even the biggest proponent of free trade, like in the academic world, where people were saying that those rules, the benefits, do not apply to finance. I mean, that was the fight between Larry Summers and Stiglitz, why I pushed Stiglitz out. It was the thing that came at the IMF versus World Bank. So it was very much a conscious political decision. And my thing is, since you are a journalist and you talk to them, was it just a question of Wall Street power, financial sector power, or was it the media was totally enthralled with this financial globalization?
Yeah, I'll give you my sense of it, and I should say I claim absolutely no clairvoyance on these issues. As I say in the prologue, when I describe my experiences in Jakarta and in Moscow and in China, what I was seeing there, I experienced at the time as sort of one-offs. I thought, okay, there's riots in Indonesia. They've had a dictator for 35 years. That's that. Now we're in Russia. There's turmoil, financial crisis. Well, they're trying to adjust the system post-communist world. And I was not connecting the dots. I did not see it as a systemic crisis or a series of alarm bells, which is how I view it today. And I think part of it, and so I would say I was part of the herd or the conventional wisdom. And there was an element of the way it was presented and discussed that, well, of course, all right-thinking people are on the side of globalization. Only a knuckle dragger or some sort of barbarian or troglodyte could be. It was only unions and their chronic protectionism because they were too lazy to compete. And that was sort of at a surface, sort of anecdotal level, I think was how the debate was framed. And there was a guy, very smart economist, a Turkish economist, Danny Roderick, who's at Harvard, who wrote a very prescient book in 97, I think it was, called How Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And this was in 1997. And he raised a lot of the concerns that, looking back from 2025, look spot on. And he tells the story of being advised by Paul Krugman, who has also had second thoughts more recently, to some degree. I don't want to overstate that. But at the time, according to Roderick, Krugman tried to talk him out of writing the book and said, you're just going to give ammunition to the barbarians. So the traditional supporters of globalization, or the sort of conventional wisdom crowd, was very hostile to dissent. Nobody was interested in really debating the finer points of it. It was just, you were either with the free market and the right-thinking people who favored one world and free markets and democracy, or you were backward and you were trapped in the past. And if you're given a choice between those two poles, it's not hard to see why one becomes sort of the more attractive of the two.
Briefly, and then we do have one more question.
My point was that people like Stiglitz and Roderick, and those are precisely the people, were saying they were pro globalization, but they said the pattern and the governance of globalization, the way it was managed, was being messed up, and there would be a backlash. And they wrote specifically about not just China, but they also talked about Russia, and they talked about what might happen in Asia, and that is why they were actually pushed out of their jobs.
Good exchange. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thanks. So a couple of things that I'll kind of frame as premises and let you respond to them. One of them is that it seems to me that the economic liberalization in China and the notion that that would lead inevitably to political liberalization, it wasn't wrong, but it also wasn't inevitable, right? That the pressures are there. They're durable, they're likely to keep pushing in that direction, but there are also lots of other forces that could delay, disrupt it. So it's a little like predicting when a bubble is going to burst in the economy, right? You see the pressures, you know the pressures are there, but can't quite know when it'll happen. The second one is that I'm a native of Missouri, and many of my friends from childhood and college, undergraduate school, are quite prosperous, quite successful people who are very strong Trump supporters. And there's some disconnect between the notion that, it's a working class issue. It's anecdotal, right? But that there's a disconnect that requires explanation as to why people who own multiple car dealerships or who are very successful lawyers or doctors or whatever are as enthusiastically Trump supporters as the working class people that lost their jobs in the Fisher body plant in Kansas City.
Yeah, both excellent points. So briefly on the first one, I think you're absolutely right. The story's not over in China. It's over as of this moment. But if there's a democratic revolution 5 years from now, the optimists of the '90s will look a lot smarter. And certainly when I was there, I can remember at one point going to the campus of Beijing University, one of the country's top universities, and talking to students there, and none of them had the slightest interest. This was probably 2002. None of them had the slightest interest in joining the Communist Party. Now, I think it's a lot different today. But at the time, that sort of change was happening. The media, in some select publications, Caixin and Southern Weekend, to name two, were much more open and were publishing stuff that was challenging vested interests in a way that you couldn't today and you couldn't have in 1980. So there was clearly the change of that sort. And I think at one point in the book, I say, the theory, it was an attractive theory, and for a time it even looked like it might be true. But then things took a turn, and I think the point is, and Rush Doshi at Brookings has a good book on that sort of gets into the weeds of the party apparatus. I think we underestimated the extent to which the Chinese leaders were aware of our theory of the case, and were going to fight to hang on to their privileges and their system. Jiang Zemin, very early on, in addressing a party conclave, said, "This is what the West is going to use this, is trying to use this to do to us what happened to the Soviet Union. We can't let that happen." And so even before, again, long before Xi Jinping came along, the leadership was aware of it, and they were taking whatever steps they could to counteract it. Your second point about more affluent supporters of Trump is exactly right. The neighbor I'm referring to is not a poor working class guy. He's a man of means. And the way I think about that is, and I say this all the time, that I'm not a fan of single variable explanations. So for anything really. So, what caused Trump? Was it just working class anger? No. Was it just rich people who want tax cuts? No. Was it just resentment of immigrants with different color skin? No. It wasn't just any one of those things. It was all of those and some other things. I mean, there are people who just can't bear the wackiness of the Democrats. And so, a good thought exercise is to imagine, if you're a Democrat who is wondering how your Republican friends could possibly have voted for Donald Trump, imagine, a Trump-like Democrat or some, figure that you might not be completely on board with up against a garden variety Republican. There are a lot of people a lot of Republicans who held their nose and voted for Trump and have done so twice despite everything, because to them, the Democrats look even nuttier.
So we've come to the top of the hour. If you could make your question brief, let's take one more question, and then David can sign some books.
I'd like to just comment on something that you said. A lot of communities were decimated by trade, but more of them were decimated by technical change. Most jobs that are lost in manufacturing are lost through technical change.
Yep.
And that sort of doesn't reach the surface, but technical change is, coming down the pike in AI, in the form of AI, and it's going to be very disruptive. So someone needs to bring that point forward. Someone needs to say it. The second point that I wanted to make was, just let me organize my thoughts here for a second. I worked in the government on trade, and much of what you propose as a solution was certainly occurring during the Obama administration. Technical incubators, small scale education programs, but very small scale. There just wasn't enough money to really push forward with the kind of experiments that you're proposing. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that those are the right things. But somebody has to make the argument for them. Someone, probably on the Democratic side.
I can recommend a good book.
All right. Well, you need to really sell it, because people don't.
I'm doing my best. I mean, I've been up here for an hour. What do you want from me?
Let me finish. Somebody has to make the argument that government is good. A lot of the narrative of the past several years, decades, is that government is the problem and government is bad. And government, has proven that in the pandemic that they can solve problems. But no Democrat is standing up and saying it.
Good. David?
Two very quick points. You're entirely right on automation, and I say that explicitly in the book. Clearly, the majority of the manufacturing job loss is caused by automation. You'll get varying estimates from economists. Is it 50%? Is it 75%?
No, it's a lot higher. It's more like 80%.
You'll get varying estimates from economists. Yeah. And they're estimates because they're a result of models. Nobody goes around and takes a census. They're the result of economic models. So they're a good indication, but whether it's 50 or 75 or 77 or 71, it is the majority. But to me, that doesn't mean you ignore the effects of trade. Just as if 4 guys jump me on my way out to my car tonight, I'm not just going to ask that 3 of them be prosecuted. I want all 4 of them to be prosecuted. And trade also gets more attention because it's something that's discussed at the national level. A president has a choice. He proposes policies. He takes them to Congress. He advocates for them. Elected officials then debate it back and forth. Nobody does that if Caterpillar wants to automate an assembly line, or if General Electric introduces a new machine on its factory floor. So it gets more attention because it's more visible. Just briefly, the other thing I would say about the Obama administration was, as you probably know, the expansion of the TAA program when the Korean Free Trade Agreement was signed covered services workers for the first time, but it only did so for 2 years. So all the corporations who benefited from provisions in that agreement benefited indefinitely, but the workers got time-limited benefits of 2 years.
What a terrific presentation.